The last light of evening bled across the plains like a wounded ember when Tala Whitebird, aged 20, made her way toward Hale Ranch with a bundle of herbs pressed to her heart. Dust clung to her ankles, whispering the same cruel truth she had carried for years. No man marries a native woman. The words hollowed her ribs, but she kept walking because hunger gnawed at her spine, and winter's chill followed close behind. She murmured softly into the wind, "But I can cook," and the wind, as always, answered with nothing but a long, listening hush that made her wonder if fate had paused just for her tonight, as though waiting. When she reached the porch, her breath trembled. The door of the ranch creaked open, and she found herself staring into the shadow of a man whose presence filled the entire frame. Dawson Hale, age 30, tall as a barn door and broad as a winter ox, studied her with quiet, steady eyes the color of storm-worn earth. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look suspicious. He simply looked at her, as if he'd been expecting a stranger to arrive at his doorstep just as the sun died. She almost looked away from the weight of his silence, but something gentler flickered behind his gaze, holding her still, uncertain, yet strangely drawn. Her voice came out small, nearly a whisper carried on the dying light. I can cook." She braced herself for the usual response. Dismissal, a turned back, a slammed door. Yet Dawson only stepped aside, nodding once with the faintest sigh of relief, as though her arrival solved a problem he'd been wrestling for weeks. And she felt her heartbeat skip, confused by a kindness so simple it felt dangerous, as if it could change something inside her she wasn't prepared to name. Inside his kitchen, Tala moved as if rediscovering lost memories, touching the wooden counters, inhaling the unfamiliar but comforting scent of dried sage hung above the window. She noticed the pots, blackened from neglect, and the sack of beans abandoned in the corner. She began working without asking permission, falling into rhythm. Hands steady, motions quiet, breath soft. Each movement felt like an anchor pulling her back into herself, a small piece of dignity returning one grain at a time. Dawson leaned against the doorway, arms folded loosely, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. His presence was so large it should have swallowed the room, yet he somehow made space for her instead, listening to the soft chopping of roots, the simmering of broth, the beating of her nervous heart. She could feel him behind her, not intruding, simply existing, and his silence felt strangely warm. She wondered why such a man looked at her as though she were a question he wanted to understand. When she set the meal down before the ranch hands, they hovered uncertainly, murmuring among themselves. Elias Boone muttered something sharp under his breath, and the others echoed with wary curiosity. Tala lowered her eyes, bracing for rejection she had known too many times. But Dawson stepped forward, lifted a spoon, tasted her stew with deliberate calm, and spoke one soft sentence that settled over the table like a blessing. "Eat." The room obeyed him with surprised gratitude, and for the first time in months, Tala felt the faint warmth of belonging flicker in her chest, trembling. The days that followed unfolded with a gentle rhythm, as if the ranch itself exhaled in relief at her presence. Tala cooked each morning before dawn, her braids swinging softly as she moved through the kitchen. Dawson always seemed to appear nearby, bringing water, stacking firewood, fixing a shelf she struggled to reach. He never pushed conversation, never hovered too close, yet she felt his eyes drift to her a little too often. Not in hunger, not in pity, in quiet wonder. And that, more than anything, frightened her because she wasn't sure her heart could survive being truly seen. The ranch hands whispered, some kindly, some cruelly. Elias, especially, mocked under his breath that Dawson was collecting strays. The words stung like fresh nettles. Then Ruth Ann from the saloon sauntered by one afternoon, tossing a careless sneer over her shoulder. Men don't marry girls like her. The sentence dug deep into Tala's ribs, reopening old bruises she had tried to bury beneath work and silence. But she kept her back straight, refusing to show the crack forming inside her. Later that evening, after the chores were done and dusk had thickened the world into blue, Dawson found her hiding behind the barn, wiping tears she tried to swallow. He sat beside her, not touching, not prying, simply letting the quiet settle between them like a soft blanket. She waited for him to ask what was wrong. He didn't. Instead, he said gently, "No one who works this hard should feel unwanted." The sincerity in his tone nearly undid her. She turned her face away, afraid of breaking open completely before him, but he remained beside her, still and steady, as if his presence alone meant to carry half her sorrow. A storm arrived days later, fierce and wild, splitting the sky with lightning that clawed across the plains. Tala rushed outside to protect the chickens, slipping on slick mud, her breath sharp with childhood memories of fire and smoke. Dawson caught her arm before she fell, his massive hand engulfing hers with terrifying gentleness. Rain poured over them, drumming on his hat, soaking her hair until it clung to her cheeks like dark ribbons. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them, two souls suspended in a storm that felt older than either of them. In the barn, thunder shaking the beams above, Tala trembled without shame. Dawson's coat fell around her shoulders, warm, heavy, smelling faintly of cedar and saddle leather. She confessed her fear of storms, how one had nearly taken everything from her as a child, and he listened with a stillness that made her chest ache. She realized then that this man did not fill silence with false comfort. He filled it with presence, with understanding, with a heaviness that felt like protection. When the storm finally softened into dawn, something fragile lingered between them, refusing to dissolve. It lived in his glance, in her breath, in the trembling awareness that they had crossed an invisible line neither of them had named. But peace never lasted long in the West. Sheriff Colton arrived a few days later, boots dusty, expression tight. He warned Dawson that harboring a native girl would stain his reputation. His tone slick with judgment made Tala shrink inward, guilt gnawing at her ribs. She whispered that she would leave so Dawson would not suffer on her account. Dawson's jaw flexed, and he answered with a dangerously calm voice, "She isn't leaving." But the sheriff's lingering smirk poisoned the air with doubt, and by dusk, Tala was quietly packing her small bundle, intending to slip away beneath moonlight. She hadn't expected him to be waiting at the gate. He stood there, arms folded, sorrow flickering across his features like a bruise. "You were just gonna walk out," he said softly. She lowered her head, unable to meet the disappointment in his eyes. He stepped closer, voice fraying at the edges. "Tala, you're my friend." The word cracked something inside her, because in his tone, friend felt deeper, heavier, almost trembling with the weight of unspoken feelings. She felt herself weaken, unsure if her staying was selfish or necessary, but the ache in Dawson's gaze pulled her back toward the porch before she even realized she'd turned around. Their connection grew in gestures rather than declarations. Dawson fixed the broken cabinet hinge she mentioned in passing. She mended the tear in his jacket without telling him. He left wildflowers on the kitchen table. She packed extra food in his saddlebag. They moved around each other like two pieces, finally recognizing the shape they fit into, even if neither dared name it aloud. Then one evening, he returned from town with blood on his knuckles after breaking up a fight. Tala's breath hitched as she helped clean his wounds, her fingertips brushing his skin with trembling care. His eyes locked on hers, soft, burning, full of something that felt like a confession trying to escape. "You deserve more than the world ever gave you," he murmured. Her breath caught. Hope was a dangerous thing, and she feared it too much to look directly into it. But when his hand gently steadied her trembling wrist, she felt the truth of his heart beat through the quiet space between them. A few nights later, standing before the fire, Tala felt her strength falter under the weight of whispers and memories. The words slipped out like a wound reopening. "No one marries a native woman, but I can cook." The sentence cracked the air. Dawson froze. Then he stepped forward, eyes burning with a fierce tenderness that made her chest ache. "Then they were blind, Tala," he said, voice thick. "Because I see you." She looked away, terrified of what believing him might cost her. But Dawson's hand brushed hers, lightly, reverently, and the world shifted again, trembling on the brink of a future she'd never dared imagine. Days later, he led her to the river at dusk. Fireflies drifted around them like floating stars. Dawson knelt, not boldly, but with a quiet, trembling humility, and asked her to marry him. His voice cracked when he said he didn't want a cook. He wanted her. Tala fell to her knees too, tears blurring the world, overwhelmed by the miracle of being chosen. When she whispered, "Yes," the river seemed to glow brighter, as though creation itself exhaled. Their wedding was simple, sacred. Beneath the cottonwood tree by the riverbank, Martha Lyle tied the ceremonial ribbon around their joined hands while the current hummed an ancient song. Dawson kissed Tala with a tenderness that made her knees weaken, and as they walked back to the ranch, her braid brushing his arm, his hand trembling at her waist, they felt the beginning of a life neither believed they would ever hold. In the weeks that followed, love settled into their home like warm sunlight. Tala's laughter returned. Dawson's shadows lightened. The ranch hands softened toward her, and even the town began to shift, slowly, reluctantly, in the wake of the dignity Dawson showed her so openly. But one afternoon, when Elias Boone muttered that Dawson had married her out of pity, something inside Dawson broke loose, not in violence but in fierce devotion. He stood before the entire ranch, voice steady, declaring Tala his equal, his partner, his pride. Not as defense, because he had nothing to defend. As truth. Tala felt the world pause. In that moment she finally saw herself through his eyes, worthy, precious, chosen. It changed her more deeply than any vow. That night, as Dawson held her close beneath the humming quiet of the plains, he whispered into her hair, "You were never unwanted, Tala. Not by me. Not for a single breath." She closed her eyes, feeling a lifetime of loneliness dissolve into warmth. And just as she drifted into sleep, she sensed something shifting again, soft, delicate, like the opening of a new chapter waiting just beyond the horizon, inviting her forward, as though the Real story was only beginning.